It was late September of 2019 when I decided to take some time off work. I had just turned 32 a few weeks earlier, and things in my life were getting way too loud. I worked in a small machine shop in a town called Leander, Texas. The days felt the same: metal, sweat, noise. I lived alone in a rented apartment next to a laundromat, where the sound of dryers running all night made sleeping harder than it already was. I didn't have many friends and no family close by. My brother had moved to Oregon years ago. We only talked maybe twice a year. I hadn't taken a real break in over 2 years. I was tired. I found a listing online for a small cabin up in Arkansas, near a place called Greer's Ferry Lake. It was about 7 hours northeast of Leander. The listing had 3 photos. One showed a square wooden cabin surrounded by thick woods. Another showed a small dock at the edge of the lake. The last one showed a simple kitchen, kind of dated but clean. The price was low, $150 for 5 nights, which felt too good to be true. But it was off-season and it wasn't a popular area, so I guessed it made sense. I didn't think much about it. I booked it for a Monday through Saturday and packed my stuff the night before. I left just after sunrise. The drive was smooth for the first few hours, mostly long, empty roads and small towns. It got prettier the closer I got to the lake. The flat Texas land slowly gave way to hills, then forests. I pulled off a 2-lane road onto a gravel one, then followed it through trees for about 15 minutes before I reached the cabin. It looked the same as in the photos: small, square, and tucked into a clearing with trees on all sides. The lake was visible about 200 feet away through a thin line of trees, calm and gray under the cloud-covered sky. It was quiet too. I stepped out of my car and just stood there for a few seconds, listening to the breeze push through the branches. It felt like I had driven away from the world. The key was in a little metal box by the door, just like the listing said. I let myself in. It was one open room with a small bed, a table, and an old couch facing a cold fireplace. The kitchen was in the corner with a small fridge, microwave, and a 2-burner stove. The bathroom was off to the side with a thin wooden door. There was no TV, no Wi-Fi. My cell signal dropped the second I turned off the main road. I unpacked my cooler and gear and set everything down. Then I sat at the table with a can of beer and stared out the window. The place felt safe in a way. Not cozy, but still, like no one could bother me. I had 4 full days to do nothing: no phone, no work, no noise. Just me and the woods. The first night was uneventful. I made a simple dinner and went for a short walk near the lake. The sky had cleared, and I could see a few stars by the time I got back. I climbed into bed, pulled the thin blanket over me, and drifted off faster than I thought I would. I woke up once, around 3 a.m., to the sound of something moving outside. It wasn't loud, more like a soft crunching on the gravel, maybe 20 feet from the cabin. I held my breath, waiting to hear it again, but everything went quiet. I got up, went to the window and looked out, but all I saw were trees and the moonlight shining on the gravel. I told myself it was probably a deer or a raccoon. The woods are full of animals. I went back to bed and didn't hear anything else. The next morning, I made eggs and toast on the stove and decided to go for a long walk down by the lake. The trail wasn't marked, but it followed the shore pretty well. I didn't see anyone, no boats or cars, just birds and squirrels and the sound of water against the rocks. I walked for almost 3 hours before heading back. I ate lunch, took a short nap on the couch, then sat on the porch with a notebook I brought, sketching a little and writing down thoughts. I didn't think about work once. That second night, I was out cold before midnight. Sometime in the early morning, I woke up to a noise again. This time it was different. It sounded like a soft tap on the side of the cabin, like someone flicking the wood with their finger. Just once. I sat up, heart racing a bit. I waited. Then, maybe a minute later, I heard a second one, closer to the window. I got up slowly and walked over, trying not to make the floorboards creak. I peeked out but saw nothing, just darkness and trees. I stood there for a few minutes trying to figure out what it could have been. Maybe branches tapping the wall? But there was no wind, and the trees weren't that close. I finally went back to bed and didn't hear anything else. I told myself I was just getting too in my head. When it's that quiet, Even the tiniest noise feels bigger than it is. The third day felt a little different. I still went for my walk, still sat outside with coffee, but I started noticing small things. There were smudged prints on the outside window by the kitchen, like someone had touched it with dirty fingers. They were faint but fresh. I thought maybe it was me when I opened it earlier, but I had only opened the front window, not the side one. Later, I saw a piece of tree bark wedged under the back door, like it had been jammed in there on purpose. I kicked it away and checked the lock. It was fine. That evening, I sat out on the porch longer than usual. I didn't feel as relaxed. My ears kept tuning in to the woods, trying to pick out strange sounds. I finally went inside and locked both doors before it even got dark. I kept the lights low and didn't start a fire, just read a book by lantern light. I thought about leaving early, but I convinced myself I was being paranoid. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to the sound of gravel shifting again. This time, I stayed in bed, completely still. I could hear its soft footsteps, slow, crunching near the side of the cabin. Then they stopped. Everything went dead quiet for maybe 5 minutes. Then I heard the back doorknob rattle. Not once, not quick. Turned slowly, just a slight metal click. I felt like ice ran through my veins. I didn't move. The door didn't open. It rattled again just once, then stopped. I got up after maybe 20 minutes of silence and grabbed my flashlight from the kitchen drawer. I turned it on and stepped to the back door. I didn't open it. I just looked out the small window beside it. Nothing. I stood there for a long time. My hands were shaking. I didn't sleep the rest of the night. When the sun came up, I walked around the cabin, checking for prints or marks. The gravel was a mess of scattered footprints, but it had been like that when I got there. Still, near the back door, I noticed something. 2 small marks in the dirt, like the toes of boots pointed toward the door. I took a deep breath and tried to think rationally. Maybe a hiker got lost? Maybe someone passing through? That day, I stayed close to the cabin. I didn't go for a walk. I kept the doors locked and checked them every hour. I kept the flashlight on the table and a kitchen knife next to my bed. Couldn't relax. I didn't know if I should leave, but I kept telling myself, just one more night. That final night was calm at first. I went to bed with my shoes on, jacket beside me, just in case. I didn't fall asleep until after 1 a.m. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I remember was waking up to the sound of the back door creaking. Not loud, but enough. The sound of the latch being forced open. I froze. I didn't get up. I just listened. The door didn't slam or burst open. Creaked just a few inches, then stopped. I heard slow footsteps inside the cabin. 1, 2, then 3. The floor creaked beneath them. My heart was beating so loud I thought it would give me away. Whoever it was didn't move fast. They walked like they were feeling their way in the dark. I could hear the soft breaths, shallow and quiet. I reached for the flashlight, clicked it on, and shone it toward the door. Nobody was there. The door was open maybe 4 inches. I stood up fast and slammed it shut, locking it tight. I backed away, heart pounding, hands shaking. I didn't hear anything else. No more steps, no voice, nothing. I stayed standing until dawn. The second the sun started coming up, I packed everything in 5 minutes. I didn't even eat. I jumped in my car and drove, not looking back once. I stopped at the nearest town, Heber Springs. I told a man at a gas station there had been someone near my cabin at night. He just shook his head and said it happened sometimes. No real police out there, just private land. I left it at that. I got back to Leander that evening. I never found out who it was. I checked the cabin listing a few weeks later. It was gone. I don't know if the owner took it down or something else happened. But what stuck with me most wasn't fear. It was how careful, how slow, and how quiet the person had been. Not like a drunk or a thief looking for cash. Felt deliberate, like they'd done it before. Since then, I haven't gone back into the woods alone. I still take breaks, but never off-grid. I need to hear cars, people, phones ringing. Anything that says I'm not alone out there. That cabin gave me what I wanted, silence. But it also reminded me why we build fences, why we lock doors, and why sometimes being alone isn't peace. It's risk. I It was October 2019 when I decided to take some time off work. I had been pushing through long shifts at a small plumbing company in Grand Junction, Colorado, and I was burnt out. My back hurt, I wasn't sleeping well, and every day felt like the same routine. I had some vacation time saved up, so I figured I'd use it before the winter months hit hard. I didn't want to fly anywhere or stay in a hotel. I just wanted to get away from people, noise, and stress. I thought a cabin in the woods would be the perfect reset button. I booked a small cabin about 2 hours north, close to a little place called Craig. It was deep in the hills, surrounded by forest. The photos on the listing showed a small wooden place, simple but clean. There was no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and no nearby neighbors. It was exactly what I needed. I packed up my truck with food, water, a cooler with ice, firewood, clothes, a flashlight, a pocket knife, and a few basic tools. I even brought a book I'd been meaning to finish for over a year. The drive out there was nice. The weather was dry, and the trees had already started changing color. The farther I got from the main roads, the quieter it became. Eventually, I turned onto a dirt road that led into the woods. It was narrow and winding, and a few times I had to stop and move branches out of the way. It took about 20 minutes of driving on that road before I reached the cabin. It was smaller than I expected. Just one room, really, with a small bathroom in the back. It had a wood stove, a little kitchenette with a propane burner, a bed, and a couple of old chairs. Everything smelled like pine and dust. There were a few windows, but they were small and high up. I unloaded my stuff and got settled. I lit the stove, unpacked my food, and sat on the porch for a while just listening to the wind in the trees. That first night was calm. I heated a can of chili, read a few chapters of my book, and then turned in early. There was no electricity, so once the sun went down, it got dark fast. I had a few battery lanterns and a headlamp, but I kept them off as much as I could to save power. The silence was the thing that struck me most. No cars, no voices, just the occasional sound of a breeze or a branch creaking. I slept better that night than I had in months. The second day, I went for a long walk. I had a compass and a printed map just in case. I followed a dry creek bed for a couple of hours and made my way up a small hill that gave a great view of the surrounding forest. I didn't see another soul all day. When I got back to the cabin, I made a fire in the pit outside and cooked some sausage and beans. It felt good to do something that simple. I stayed up a little later that night, staring at the stars. It was the third day when things started to feel different. I woke up around 6 a.m. and noticed something odd right away. There were fresh boot prints in the dirt near the porch. I hadn't seen them the day before. I walked around the cabin slowly, looking at the ground. They circled the place once, then led off into the woods behind it. The prints looked fresh. No leaves inside them yet, no signs of weathering. I stood there for a while, just listening. I didn't hear anything unusual. I tried to tell myself it was probably just a hunter passing through, maybe someone out scouting. But the road to get here wasn't easy, and there weren't any signs of a vehicle coming in after mine. No new tracks, nothing disturbed on the way in. And besides, why would a hunter walk around the cabin and leave? I spent most of that day near the cabin. I kept a fire going and stayed alert. I didn't want to overreact, but something about it made me uneasy. That night, I locked the door, even though the lock was just a simple latch. I moved one of the chairs against the door as a kind of makeshift alarm. If someone tried to come in, the chair would fall over and make noise. I slept lightly, waking up at the smallest sounds, but nothing happened. On the fourth day, I found something else. About 30 yards from the cabin, near a small clearing, I noticed some bark stripped off a tree at about shoulder height. Underneath it, there were scratches, thin, straight lines, like they were made with a knife. They weren't there 2 days ago, I was sure of it. I looked around again. I didn't see anyone, didn't hear anything, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. That night, I heard footsteps. It was around 2 a.m. I had woken up to use the bathroom and was sitting in the dark, trying to decide if I wanted to go outside or just hold it. Then I heard them. Soft, slow steps on the dry leaves outside. They came from the side of the cabin, moved around the back, then stopped. I didn't move. I held my breath and listened. There were no animals that walked like that. Too quiet, too slow. I reached for my flashlight but didn't turn it on. After a long minute, the steps moved again, back toward the front of the cabin. Then they stopped again. I waited. No knock, no voice, nothing. After a while, I couldn't hear anything. I didn't sleep again that night. When the sun came up, I checked the area. More boot prints. These were closer to the front of the cabin. Whoever it was had walked right up to the porch just like before. I scanned the trees but didn't see anything. I didn't want to panic, but I also knew this wasn't normal. I still had a few days left on the rental, but I was starting to think about cutting it short. I kept busy during the day, chopped some wood, cleaned up the inside, rechecked the food. Everything seemed untouched. But every time I looked out the window, I felt like someone was watching from the trees. It was a low, crawling feeling. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Like I was being studied. That night, I didn't sleep at all. I stayed up with my knife in my hand, the headlamp on my lap, and the chair still against the door. At around 3 a.m., I heard a sound. Something brushed the window, just once. A soft sound like a hand or sleeve. I didn't move. I waited, but nothing else happened. I made up my mind to leave the next morning. I had enjoyed the quiet at first, but now it felt wrong. I wanted out. As soon as the sky started to lighten, I packed everything up and loaded the truck. I took one last walk around the cabin, and that's when I found it. On the back side, carved into the wood near the base, were 3 letters, LRT. They were fresh, no weathering. I hadn't seen them when I first arrived. I didn't know what they meant, and I didn't want to stick around to find out. The drive back was tense. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting someone to be following. But I didn't see another person the whole way out. When I got to the main road, I stopped at a gas station with a small sheriff's substation nearby. I went in and told the guy at the counter about the boot prints and the scratches and the footsteps. He looked at me like I was overreacting, but he wrote something down and said he'd pass it on to the local deputy. I didn't press it. I just wanted to get home. Back in Grand Junction, I unpacked and took the longest shower of my life. The next few nights, I kept waking up every hour, checking the windows, listening for footsteps. Eventually, I got back to normal. Work picked up again, and life moved on. But I've never gone back to that cabin. I looked it up again once, just out of curiosity, but the listing was gone. The owner must have taken it down, or maybe someone else had a worse experience than I did. I still think about it sometimes. Who was out there? What were they doing, watching, walking around? Maybe it was nothing more than a drifter, a lost hiker. But they never tried to talk, never made themselves known. Just silent, slow steps in the dark. It wasn't ghosts or anything like that. It was something real. Person, living, breathing. And that's what makes it worse. Because people, real people, can be far scarier than anything made up. I learned that out there in the quiet, and I don't think I'll ever be able to fully relax in the woods again. I was 34 the summer I decided to rent a remote cabin in the Adirondacks. It was early August of 2021. I'd been living in Buffalo and working from home since the pandemic hit, and by the time that summer rolled around, I couldn't take being in the city any longer. I needed a break. Not just a weekend either. I wanted to really be alone for a while. No traffic, no neighbors, no screens. Just the woods and the quiet. I found the cabin on an older listing site that wasn't used as much anymore. It looked rough but authentic. The photos were grainy, but it had the basics. A wood stove, a kitchen, a porch with a view of the lake. No Wi-Fi, no cell signal, no electricity besides a generator. I didn't want luxury. I just wanted silence. It was listed by someone named E. Lambert, and they asked for the full payment up front via bank transfer, which made me hesitate, but something about the whole thing, how off-grid it was, felt right. It was just under a 5-hour drive from Buffalo. The paved road narrowed until it was gravel, then dirt, and finally just a pair of old tire tracks cutting through thick woods. I drove slowly, worried about damaging the undercarriage of my car. Branches scraped along the sides, and I had to stop twice to drag fallen limbs off the trail. The forest was thick and green, with tall pines and damp earth. It smelled like moss and rain. By the time I reached the clearing where the cabin sat, it was late afternoon. The place looked older than it had in the photos. Weather-beaten logs, patches of moss on the roof, a rusted chimney pipe sticking out of the side. There were 3 steps up to a small porch and a heavy wooden door with a stiff latch. The windows had old, dusty screens and no glass, just storm shutters I could close at night. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and old ash. There was a single room with a bed frame, a wood stove, a cracked leather armchair, and a table with 2 chairs. The kitchen area was a counter with an old hand pump for water, a propane stove, and a few cabinets filled with dented pots and mismatched silverware. There was a shed a few yards out back that held firewood, some tools, and a rusty gas can with a note on it. For generator, use sparingly. It was quiet. Not just in the sense of no people, there was an actual thickness to the silence. The kind that makes your ears feel hollow. At night, I heard insects and the occasional splash of something in the lake, but otherwise, it was just still. The kind of still that makes you more aware of your own breathing. The first few days were peaceful. I set routines for myself. Wake up early, make oatmeal, take long walks around the lake, read by the water, cook dinner at dusk, then sit on the porch until the light faded. I brought a few books and a journal, and I was starting to feel like my mind was clearing out. I didn't realize how cluttered it had gotten until I was truly away from everything. The first odd thing was small. On the 4th morning, I noticed the woodpile looked slightly different. I'd been stacking the split logs neatly, and one side of the stack looked like it had slumped a little. I assumed it was just gravity or maybe a squirrel or something. But later that day, when I went to the shed to get the axe, I noticed a fresh gouge in the doorframe, a vertical scratch about 6 inches long, too low for it to have been done by the axe hanging on the wall. It looked fresh, too. The exposed wood was bright and pale. That night, I thought I heard something moving outside. Not an animal. It was a soft tread, almost deliberate. I got up from bed and stood near the window, listening. I could hear the creak of the porch boards. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. Whoever it was didn't knock, didn't try the door. Just stood there for a minute, maybe 2, then left. The silence returned, but it felt different, tense. In the morning, I walked a wide circle around the cabin. The ground was soft from the rain the night before. I found faint footprints in the mud near the woodpile. Not boots, bare feet. Adult-sized. The prints led off into the trees and vanished where the ground dried up. My heart was pounding as I stared at them. I stood there for a long time just looking into the forest. I wasn't sure what I expected to see. Eventually, I went back inside and locked the door. I kept checking over my shoulder all day. That night, I stayed up. I turned off all the lights and sat in the chair by the window, wrapped in a blanket. It was cold. I didn't want to light the stove because I didn't want the glow to give me away. I waited, listening. Around 2 in the morning, I heard something again. Footsteps. Slow, careful. They came up onto the porch. I held my breath. The steps creaked. Then I heard the scrape of something against the side of the cabin, wood against wood. It lasted maybe 5 seconds. Then the steps moved away. I stayed in the chair until dawn. When it got light, I went outside. There was a mark on the side of the cabin. Another gouge. This one wider, rougher, and higher up than the one on the shed. A few feet to the left, the bark on a nearby tree had been stripped in a long, clean line. I started packing that morning. But as I threw my gear into the duffel, I kept stopping to look out the windows. I felt like someone was watching me. The hairs on my arms were standing up. I couldn't see anyone, but I knew I wasn't alone. I walked out to the car with my bag, threw it in the back seat, and tried to start the engine. Nothing, just a click. I tried again. Same thing. I popped the hood and checked the battery cables. They were tight. I looked under the car. One of the fuel lines had been cut. Not chewed. Cut cleanly. I stood up slowly, heart racing. My breath felt shallow. I scanned the trees. Nothing moved. I walked back to the cabin and locked the door behind me. I had no phone service, and the generator only worked in short bursts. I tried the old radio that was stored in one of the cabinets, but it wouldn't pick up any signal. I spent the rest of the day listening, peeking out the window. I ate a cold dinner and barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured someone crouching just outside, waiting. The next morning, I made a plan. I packed water, some food, a flashlight, and the hatchet from the shed into a backpack. I left a note on the table in case someone came by after me. I decided to hike out. The nearest road was about 10 miles back in the direction I'd come from. It would be a long walk, but I couldn't stay. I locked up and started walking, staying off the dirt path in case someone was watching it. The woods were quiet, too quiet. Even the birds seemed to be gone. About an hour in, I heard something behind me. At first it was faint, just the crack of a branch. Then again closer. I stopped and listened. My heart was pounding. The woods were dense, but I thought I saw something dark move between the trees. I kept walking faster now. The weight of the pack felt heavier with every step. The air was thick with heat. I stopped again a few miles in to drink some water and catch my breath. That's when I saw it. Something small nailed to a tree a few yards off the path. I walked closer. It was a bundle of cloth, soaked in something dark, maybe old blood. A feather and a strip of fabric were tied around it with twine. I don't know why, but it made my stomach twist. I backed away and kept walking, almost jogging now. Every few minutes I stopped and looked behind me. I didn't see anyone, but I felt eyes on me the whole time. I finally reached the old forest road by late afternoon. I turned left and followed it, hoping to find help. After maybe 2 miles, I saw a truck parked off to the side. Relief flooded through me, but when I got closer, I saw that it was covered in dust and leaves. The tires were flat. The back window was broken. It looked like it had been there for months. I didn't stop. I kept walking until I finally saw a small ranger station. It looked closed, but there was a truck parked out front. I banged on the door until someone came out. I explained everything. They called in state police. We went back the next day with them to the cabin. My car was still there, but the cabin looked different. The woodpile was gone. The gouges had been sanded down. The shed was empty. The note I'd left was missing. Inside, it looked cleaner, almost like someone had been expecting company. The police searched the woods, but they didn't find anything. No footprints, no cloth bundle, nothing. They questioned me for hours, but didn't accuse me of anything. I filed a report and left. I haven't gone back. I sold the car. I moved to a different city. I still wake up sometimes in the middle of the night thinking I hear footsteps on a porch that isn't there. I don't know who was out there. I don't know how long they'd been watching me, but I know someone was, and I know I got out just in time. I rented the cabin in late October of 2017. I was 32 at the time, working as a freelance mechanical draftsman out of Pittsburgh. I'd been under pressure from a long stretch of deadlines, and my eyes were always bloodshot from too many hours staring at screens. It wasn't burnout exactly. I could still function, but I needed a break. Something without traffic or internet or phone calls. I started looking for quiet places to disappear into for a few days. I didn't want to go far, just something a couple hours away, somewhere isolated. After scrolling through a few listings, I found a small one-bedroom cabin deep in the Monongahela National Forest in West Virginia. The photos showed a mossy A-frame structure, all dark wood and shadow, buried in a thick wall of pines. It had a wood-burning stove, a fire pit, and an old generator in a locked shed out back. There was no plumbing, just a rain barrel and a composting toilet inside a crooked wooden closet. It didn't bother me. I liked the idea of something old and uncomfortable. It made the experience feel more real, like it had forced me to actually rest. The owner only accepted cash and gave me the key in person at a diner off the side of a highway just before the state line. He handed me a paper map with directions scribbled across it in shaky handwriting. I didn't think much of it. Some people just didn't want strangers knowing their address online. He told me the generator might need to be primed if it sat for more than a day and said I should bring extra food, since the closest town was almost 40 minutes down a dirt road. The drive took longer than I expected. I passed through small towns and narrow highways until I reached a crumbling side road that bent its way up into the hills. The trees got thicker. Every mile looked the same. Eventually the dirt turned to gravel, and then the gravel gave way to broken tire tracks cutting through a patch of muddy woods. I followed the marks for what felt like forever before the cabin appeared through the trees. It looked exactly like the photos, weathered, sunken slightly on one side, with moss crawling up its front wall. I parked beside a pile of chopped firewood and walked up to the front door, turning the key with both hands. The door opened with a loud wooden creak that echoed into the forest. Inside, the cabin was simple. Just one big room with a cot pushed against the back wall, a small table, and a little stove that looked like it hadn't been cleaned in years. The air smelled like dust and dried leaves. There was a narrow staircase leading up to a tiny loft that had nothing but a single mattress pushed into a corner. I liked it right away. It felt untouched, quiet in a way that didn't seem fragile. The first night was cold. I built a fire in the stove and wrapped myself in the thick wool blanket I found folded on the bed. I read a paperback novel by headlamp and drifted off around midnight. No cars, no sirens, no phones. Just the wind and the sound of the trees outside creaking against themselves. The next morning, I made coffee on a little camp stove and walked the trail behind the cabin. There was a path barely wide enough for a person to walk through, and it followed a shallow creek that wrapped through the forest. I hiked maybe 2 miles before turning back. The air was so quiet I could hear my boots scraping the dirt. I saw a few deer prints in the mud and what might have been bear scat, but nothing unusual. When I got back to the cabin, the sun was already starting to dip. I brought in more wood, locked the door, and spent the night sketching in my notebook by flashlight. That second night, I noticed something strange around 3 in the morning. I woke up suddenly and wasn't sure why. I didn't hear anything at first, just the soft groan of the old cabin walls. But then I noticed the fire was out. I could see my breath. I got up to stoke it again and heard a faint sound outside, like something brushing against the porch. Not walking, more like a slow drag. I stood still for a long time, waiting. The sound didn't return. I figured it was an animal, maybe a raccoon or a deer passing through. I tried not to think much of it, but it left me a little on edge. The next morning, I walked around the cabin looking for tracks. The ground was soft, and I expected to see prints near the steps, but there weren't any. No raccoon prints, no deer marks, nothing. The leaves didn't look disturbed either. I told myself maybe I was just half asleep and imagined it. That day was colder, so I stayed inside sketching engine layouts from old magazine clippings. I boiled water from the rain barrel and cleaned up a bit with a rag and a bar of soap. Around dusk, I noticed something that made my stomach knot. One of the chairs from the fire pit out back had been moved. I remembered lining them up in a half circle when I got there, just out of habit, but now one of them was pointed away toward the woods. I didn't remember doing that. I walked over to it and stared out into the trees for a long time. The forest was dark and quiet. The longer I stood there, the more uneasy I felt, like I was being watched. I brought the chair back to its spot and went inside. That night, I locked the door, double-checked the windows, and left the hatchet I used for splitting wood leaning against the inside wall, just in case. I didn't sleep much that night. Every little creak of the cabin felt louder. Around 2 in the morning, I heard that sound again, that same dragging noise. This time it was followed by a faint knock. Not on the door. It sounded like it came from the wall. Just once, then silence. I sat in the dark for nearly an hour, my flashlight in one hand and the hatchet in the other, waiting. Nothing else happened. When the sun finally came up, I stepped outside, heart pounding, and looked around the cabin again. Still no prints, no disturbed leaves, the same as before. I was starting to feel paranoid. That morning, I decided to hike farther down the trail behind the cabin. I needed to clear my head. I packed a bag with water and a snack, grabbed my walking stick, and followed the creek deeper into the woods. After maybe 3 miles, the trail curved sharply and dropped into a small hollow. That's when I saw something that stopped me dead. There was an old structure tucked into the hill. Not a house, more like a bunker. A small concrete cube with a rusted steel door, half covered in dirt and leaves. It had no windows, just a faded metal pipe sticking out from the top. I walked up slowly, expecting it to be locked, but the door was open just a crack. I didn't go inside. I wasn't even sure it was safe. The smell coming from it was strong, like old fuel and rotting wood. I stood there for a minute, just staring, then backed away and returned to the trail. Something about it felt wrong. When I got back to the cabin that afternoon, the chair by the fire pit had been moved again. This time it was facing directly away from the cabin. I knew I hadn't touched it. I felt a slow panic start to build in my chest. I walked over to the edge of the woods and scanned the trees, looking for any sign of movement. There was nothing. That night I barely slept. I didn't even try. I sat in a corner of the room with my flashlight and the hatchet, watching the door. Around 4 in the morning, I heard the dragging again. It was louder this time, like something scraping over the porch boards. Then I heard the soft knock, this time twice, then silence. I didn't move. I didn't open the door. I waited until sunrise, then stepped outside again. Still nothing. No tracks. No sign anyone had been there. I wanted to leave. I was ready to pack up and go, but something in me felt like I couldn't just run off. I had one more night booked, and part of me wanted to push through, to not let the fear win. I told myself it could still be an animal, that maybe the dragging was a branch scraping the roof. I made coffee, chopped more wood, and forced myself to calm down. That final night, I left the lantern on. I stayed on the lower floor, didn't go to the loft. I left the hatchet beside me and set a pan against the doorframe to act as a crude alarm. I waited. Around midnight, the noise came back. This time, it wasn't dragging. It was footsteps, slow, deliberate steps on the porch. Then silence. Then a thud, like something heavy being set down. I didn't sleep. I sat there until dawn. When I finally worked up the courage to open the door the next morning, I found something waiting on the porch. A tin can. An old one, rusted and covered in dirt, with no label. It was empty. I don't know why, but it chilled me more than anything else. Someone had been there. Someone who didn't want to be seen. Someone who was watching. I packed my things immediately. I didn't clean. I didn't put the wood away. I just loaded my gear into the car, locked the door, and drove back down that broken road without looking in the rearview mirror. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. When I got home, I emailed the cabin owner, told him I'd left a day early. I didn't ask him anything. I didn't want to know. I never reported it. There wasn't anything to report. No crime, no damage, just a creeping sense that I wasn't supposed to be there, that the woods had their own rules, and I'd gotten too close to something I didn't understand. Years later, I sometimes pull up the map and try to find that trail again. I've never seen the bunker marked on any satellite images. Maybe it was a storm shelter. Maybe I was 31 the summer I took a break from everything and rented a small cabin deep in the northern woods of Maine. It was 2022. I'd been working in IT support for 9 years in Boston, and I'd hit that point where my life felt like it was running on autopilot. Wake up, log in, fix broken connections, eat junk, go to bed. That cycle had worn me down in ways I didn't realize until my hands started shaking at night for no reason. I didn't want a resort or a beach. I just wanted somewhere quiet where I could breathe without hearing cars or people every second of the day. I found the cabin through an old post on a forum I used to visit, something someone had shared years ago and I'd bookmarked for no real reason at the time. It was owned by an older man named Terry who had passed away, and now his son was renting it out for cheap to cover the taxes on the land. It was remote, about 15 miles off the nearest main road, tucked between hills, trees, and streams. It had electricity but no Wi-Fi, no cell service, and only one old landline that barely worked. That was exactly what I wanted. I drove out there in early August, packed my Subaru with 2 weeks worth of food, a few books, some basic tools, and a 9mm pistol my cousin had given me years ago that I'd barely fired more than once. The drive was mostly uneventful, winding through pine forests and back roads that grew narrower and bumpier the deeper I got. By the time I reached the dirt trail that led to the cabin, the trees had closed in like a tunnel. Dust kicked up behind me, and the GPS had given up 5 miles back. When I pulled up to the cabin, I was surprised by how well kept it looked. A single-story structure with a sloped roof, rough cedar siding, and a small front porch. The windows were clean, the steps solid, the door freshly painted dark green. There was a small woodshed to the left, an old hand pump out back that still worked, and a cleared area with a rusty fire pit ring. The forest stretched out in every direction like a wall, dense and quiet. Inside, it was simple. One main room with a couch, table, and old armchair. A wood stove sat in the corner near a pile of cut logs. The kitchen was just a small counter, sink, fridge, and stove. Off the main room was a bathroom with a composting toilet and a shower hooked to a rain barrel tank on the roof. The bedroom had a full-size bed, dresser, and a single dusty mirror on the wall. There was no TV, no radio, just shelves of old books and board games. The first few days were peaceful. I fell into a rhythm. I'd wake up early, stretch, make coffee on the stove, then sit on the porch listening to the birds and the wind. I took long walks through the woods with a compass and notebook, marking trees and paths. I cooked simple meals, read for hours, and slept like a log. My phone stayed off. The anxiety that had followed me for years started to loosen its grip. But around the 5th day, I noticed something strange. Started small. I was hiking a ridge behind the cabin when I found a small, freshly broken branch sticking out at waist height across the trail. I thought nothing of it, figured it was just a natural fall or a deer. But the next morning, it was back, in the same spot but tied with twine between 2 trees like a tripwire. The twine was old and frayed, but it was tied deliberately. I took it down, confused, and kept walking. Later that night, I heard what sounded like a rock being thrown against the side of the cabin. A single loud thump, then silence. I stepped outside with my flashlight, scanned the trees, but saw nothing. I chalked it up to a branch or maybe an animal. Raccoons, maybe a bear. But the air felt different. Still, watching, I locked the doors for the first time since arriving. The next day, I went out to the same trail again. The twine was there. Same spot, same style, tied tight. But this time, a small round stone sat in the middle of the path. On it, carved in shaky lines, was an X. It didn't look machine-made. It looked like someone had scratched it in with a blade or nail. I took a photo of it with my camera and kicked it into the brush. Back at the cabin, I pulled the blinds and loaded the pistol. I hadn't even unpacked the bullets until then. I kept it on the table next to me while I ate dinner, my eyes flicking to the windows every few minutes. I tried reading but couldn't focus. Every creak of the wood felt louder. I checked the locks on the doors twice before going to bed. I didn't sleep well. Around 2 a.m., I woke up to a scraping noise on the side of the cabin. Not loud, just a slow drag of something metal or rough against wood. It stopped when I sat up. I stayed in bed, holding the gun, listening for over an hour before drifting off again with it in my hand. The morning brought no sign of damage. No marks, no scratches. I walked the perimeter and didn't find anything. But 100 yards into the trees, I found another stone. This one was bigger, flat like a plate, and propped up on a tree stump. In the center was another X, but deeper, cleaner, surrounded by 4 smaller marks like tally lines. Beneath it, buried halfway into the ground, was a crude snare trap made from twine and sticks. I disarmed it and walked back to the cabin quickly. I started keeping the gun with me at all times after that. Day 9 was the breaking point. I decided to leave early. Whatever was happening out there, I didn't want to know anymore. I packed up that morning, loaded everything into the car, and got ready to head out. But when I turned the key in the ignition, the engine clicked once and died. I tried again. Same result. I popped the hood, thinking it might be the battery cables, but the wires to the starter had been cut clean. Not chewed, cut with a blade. The ends were sliced flat and even. I stood there for a long time, just staring into the trees, every hair on my neck standing up. I went back inside and locked the doors, heart pounding. My only option was the landline, which was mounted to the wall in the kitchen. I picked it up and got nothing. No dial tone. I opened the bottom panel and found the cord ripped out from the wall behind it. clean as the engine wires. Someone had been inside, or I had left the door unlocked, and they got in when I slept. I didn't eat that day. I closed all the blinds, kept the pistol on my lap, and sat by the window watching the woods. The hours dragged. At one point, I saw movement, a shape between the trees too far to make out clearly, but it wasn't an animal. It didn't move like one. It stood still for over 5 minutes. Then it stepped back and disappeared. That night was the worst. I didn't sleep at all. Around midnight, I heard footsteps, slow, soft, moving along the porch outside. The boards creaked under weight. I aimed the pistol at the door and didn't blink for what felt like hours. Something brushed the window, then silence again. In the morning, I opened the door to find a single stone on the welcome mat. No X this time, just smooth and gray. I threw it into the woods as hard as I could. I rationed what little food I had left and stayed inside for 3 more days. No more noises, no more traps, but I didn't feel safe. I started thinking I might have a better shot walking out. 15 miles was a long way, but if I left at sunrise, I could make it to the main road by afternoon. I packed only what I needed: water, some snacks, the pistol, a compass, and a small flashlight. I left at dawn on the 14th day. The forest was dead quiet. No birds, no wind, just me and the crunch of boots on dirt. I followed the trail I had marked with rocks and torn bits of fabric over the week. I made good time, barely stopping. My hands shook, not from fear this time, but from exhaustion and adrenaline. Around the 7th mile, I heard branches breaking behind me. I stopped, aimed the pistol, but saw nothing. I didn't run, I kept walking fast, head on a swivel. I saw no one, but I knew I wasn't alone. By the time I reached the main road, it was nearly 2 p.m. I flagged down a pickup after waiting almost an hour. The man inside didn't ask many questions, just gave me a ride to the sheriff's station 2 towns over. I filed a report. They sent someone to the cabin later that week. The report they gave me afterwards said they found signs of tampering. Cut wires, traps, the same stones with carvings. But no footprints, no fingerprints, no sign of who did it. They told me it might have been squatters, maybe someone playing games, maybe something more serious. They said I was lucky to get out. I never went back. I left Boston a few months later, moved in with my brother in New Hampshire, and started over. But even now, years later, I still think about that cabin, about how quiet the woods were, about the rocks, the tripwires, the excess. Someone was out there, not a ghost or a monster, just a person, watching, waiting. I don't need to know why. I'm just glad I left before they decided to do more than watch. I was 31 when I decided to take a week off and spend some time alone in a cabin up north. It was October 2022, and I had just quit my job in Dayton, Ohio after nearly 8 years. The stress had been eating me alive, and I needed space to breathe without phone calls, meetings, or even the sound of cars. I'd grown up spending summers with my uncle in northern Michigan, and the quiet there had always stuck with me. So I found a small, off-the-grid cabin for rent near Gaylord, Michigan. It was about 35 minutes outside of town, sitting along a dirt road that barely showed up on GPS. The listing said it had solar power, a backup generator, and a small wood stove. That sounded good enough. I drove up early on a Monday morning. I brought with me everything I thought I'd need: cans of food, bottled water, warm clothes, a battery-powered radio, and a few books. I also packed a hunting knife my dad gave me years ago. I didn't plan to hunt, but being out there alone, I figured it wouldn't hurt to carry it. The drive took close to 6 hours. Once I got off the main roads, the scenery changed. Tall pines lined both sides of the road, and the sky seemed more open. The paved roads turned to gravel, then dirt. I drove slow to avoid popping a tire. There were no other cars, no houses, just trees, the road, and the occasional deer. I finally found the turnoff to the cabin, a narrow path that dipped into the woods and almost didn't look like a road at all. The trees got thicker as I drove in, scraping against my car. After about half a mile, I reached a clearing, and there it was. A small wooden cabin with a rusted metal roof, a little front porch, and a stone chimney. The air smelled like pine and dry leaves. The place looked like it hadn't been used much recently, but it stood solid. I got out, stretched, and walked up to the front door. The lockbox opened with the code the owner had emailed me, and the key turned easily in the lock. Inside, it was dusty but warm. There was a small kitchen with a propane stove and sink, a tiny table with 2 chairs, and a cot with a thick sleeping bag already laid out. The wood stove sat in the corner with a stack of chopped wood beside it. There were no clocks, no TV, no internet. I liked that. I spent the first day settling in. I unpacked my supplies, stacked the canned food neatly on the counter, and set up my radio on the windowsill. I tested the solar lights and the backup generator. Everything worked. That night, I sat on the porch with a blanket and listened to the forest. It was dead quiet except for the occasional rustle of leaves. I fell asleep easily and slept hard. The next few days were peaceful. I hiked around the woods during the day, following old trails and animal paths. The trees were thick, and the ground was soft with fallen leaves. I saw deer tracks, a few squirrels, and once, a fox darting between trees. I ate simple meals, read books, and chopped a bit of wood just to feel like I was doing something. I didn't hear a single plane or car. No cell service either. I liked being unreachable. It wasn't until the 4th day that I noticed something strange. I'd gone on a longer hike that morning, making my way toward a low hill I'd seen in the distance. The weather had turned a little colder, and the wind was picking up. I remember getting to the top of the hill and realizing I could see my own cabin way back in the distance. That meant I hadn't gone as far as I thought. I turned to head back and noticed a small pile of stones off to the side of the trail. It looked like someone had stacked them intentionally. 3 flat rocks, one on top of the other like a marker. I assumed it was some hiker's trail sign. I left it alone. When I got back to the cabin, I noticed something off. One of the chopped logs I'd stacked near the wood stove was lying in the middle of the floor. I hadn't left it there. I was sure of that. I'm not the tittiest person in the world, but I'd been keeping things orderly in the cabin. It unsettled me, but I figured maybe I knocked it over without noticing. I put it back and brushed it off. That night, I couldn't sleep as easily. The wind was louder, and the forest sounded more alive. Twigs snapped outside now and then, and I kept imagining someone walking around out there. I reminded myself that deer and raccoons make those kinds of sounds. I forced myself to stay in bed. The next morning, I noticed tracks near the porch. At first, I thought they were deer prints, but they looked more like boot prints. Not hiking boots, something heavier. Work boots, maybe. The prints circled the cabin once and then disappeared into the woods. I stared at them for a long time. I hadn't seen anyone in days. Not a single soul. I tried to calm myself down. Maybe someone was out hunting. Still, they'd have no reason to be that close to my cabin. And why circle it? I stayed close to the cabin that day. Kept the knife on me even inside. Every sound outside made me jump. The forest didn't feel quiet anymore. Felt like it was holding its breath. I didn't leave the porch after dark. I kept the generator off to stay quiet and only lit one lamp inside. Sometime after midnight, I heard something. It wasn't an animal. It was footsteps, slow, heavy, moving around the side of the cabin. I sat up in the cot, holding the knife tight, my heart pounding. I didn't breathe. The footsteps stopped near the porch, then retreated. I didn't sleep after that. The next morning, I went outside and checked. The boot prints were back, clearer this time. They came up from the woods and stopped a few feet from the front steps. Then they turned around. I scanned the woods for movement but saw nothing. I considered packing up and leaving early, but my car was the only way out, and if someone was messing with me, they could easily wait along the narrow road. I decided I'd wait until first light the next day and leave. I spent that day boarding up the windows as best I could. There were no shutters, so I moved furniture against them from the inside. I made sure the door locks worked. I didn't turn on the lights that night. I sat in the dark with the knife and waited. Around 2 a.m., I heard the footsteps again. This time, they came all the way up to the porch. I sat frozen in the dark. I heard the slow creak of the porch boards, then a sound like something being dragged across the wood. Couldn't breathe. Then it stopped. I sat in the dark for what felt like an hour, listening. Eventually, I fell asleep sitting up, knife still in hand. At first light, I packed everything I could into one bag, grabbed my car keys, and got out. Outside, I saw deep boot prints on the porch and a fresh scratch on the door. Long and rough, like someone had dragged a tool or blade across it. I didn't look back. I threw my bag in the car and drove fast down the trail, nearly hitting a branch that had fallen across the road. I didn't care. I didn't stop until I hit the main highway. I made it back to Dayton that night. I didn't tell anyone what happened. I didn't call the cabin owner. I never went back for the refund or deposit. I didn't even want to think about that place. But a few days after I got back, I pulled out my phone and zoomed in on that area near Gaylord using satellite view. I traced the road leading to the cabin. Then I noticed something. About half a mile into the woods behind the cabin, there was a small clearing. Zooming in, I could see what looked like the remains of another cabin. Collapsed roof, blackened walls, overgrown. It wasn't on the listing or mentioned anywhere. I don't know what happened out there, and I don't want to know. But someone was still walking those woods, and they knew I was there. The air was crisp as I arrived at the cabin, the faint scent of pine filling my nose as I stepped out of the car. It had been a long drive through winding roads, and the tiredness was starting to settle in, but I was here now. I had been planning this trip for months, a quiet weekend to unwind, escape the stress of work, and reconnect with nature. The cabin, tucked away in the woods, was supposed to be the perfect retreat. Isolated, cozy, and just the kind of place I needed to clear my head. I was 32. My name was Sam, and I had recently gone through a difficult breakup. I needed some space. The idea of being alone, away from the noise of daily life, sounded like exactly what I needed. I had rented the cabin from a website where it had been listed as remote, peaceful, and perfect for relaxation. No one else was supposed to be around for the weekend, just me, nature, and my thoughts. As I stood there, taking in the sight of the small cabin, I noticed how still everything was. The only sound was the rustling of leaves in the light breeze and the occasional chirp of a bird in the distance. The cabin itself was quaint, made of dark wood with a steep roof and a small porch. It looked old but well-maintained, surrounded by towering trees that seemed to create a natural barrier from the outside world. I grabbed my bag from the trunk, locked the car, and walked up the creaky steps to the front door. The key, left under the mat as instructed, turned easily in the lock. Inside, the cabin was just as advertised, simple and rustic, with wooden beams overhead and a stone fireplace in the center. A large window at the far end of the room looked out onto the forest, giving the whole space a quiet, open feel. A few old, mismatched chairs and a sturdy wooden table made up the basic furniture, and there was a small kitchen off to one side. The first thing I did was open the windows. The air inside felt stuffy and stale, so I let in the cool breeze from outside, hoping it would help freshen things up. Then, I set my bag down and took a deep breath, savoring the peace that surrounded me. No cars, no people, just the whisper of the wind through the trees. I had packed light, some food, a couple of books, and a journal. I wasn't expecting much company, and that was exactly how I wanted it. I made myself a cup of tea, sat by the window, and spent the rest of the afternoon just watching the forest. The light began to fade as evening came, and I decided to get a fire going in the fireplace. I hadn't planned on being outside much, but the thought of sitting by the fire, reading, and unwinding seemed perfect. As night settled in, I found myself feeling more at ease. The fire crackled and popped, and the shadows danced on the walls. The cabin felt warm and comforting. There was a sense of serenity here that I hadn't realized I was missing until now. But as the hours passed, something shifted. It was subtle at first, just a feeling in the pit of my stomach that I couldn't quite place. I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, even though I was certain no one else was supposed to be around. The silence outside was thick, almost too thick. No animals, no wind, just an eerie calm that felt unnatural. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just the isolation getting to me. Maybe I was imagining things. Around midnight, I decided to go to bed. The bedroom was simple. Just a small bed with thick blankets and a window that overlooked the trees. I climbed under the covers, the soft rustling of the fabric filling the room. But sleep wouldn't come easily. Every small creak of the cabin seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. Every shadow outside seemed to stretch and move. I turned over, trying to get comfortable, but the unease kept me awake. At some point, I must have drifted off, because the next thing I remember was the sound of something moving outside. It was soft at first, like the brush of leaves against the ground. But then it came again, louder, unmistakable footsteps crunching on the forest floor. My heart skipped a beat. I sat up, straining to listen, but the footsteps stopped just as quickly as they had started. I told myself it was probably an animal, maybe a deer or some other creature, but I wasn't so sure. My mind kept racing with possibilities. I got out of bed, trying not to make a sound, and went over to the window. The forest outside was dark, the trees swaying gently in the wind, but there was no sign of movement. I was about to turn away when I noticed something, just a flash of light, like a reflection, deep in the woods. I squinted, but the more I tried to focus, the less clear it became. My stomach churned, and a sense of unease washed over me. What could it be? It wasn't like a flashlight or anything I'd expect to see out here. After a long moment of hesitation, I backed away from the window, my nerves on edge. I tried to ignore the feeling creeping over me, the unease gnawing at my insides. I decided I would just go back to bed, tell myself it was nothing, and get some rest. But sleep didn't come. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong. That's when I heard it again, this time louder and closer. A knock at the front door. My breath caught in my throat. I was sure no one was supposed to be here. I had checked the booking confirmation. There was no mention of anyone else staying nearby. Yet here I was, alone in a cabin with someone or something, outside. I felt frozen in place, my body tense, as I listened for any further sounds. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a rustling noise, like someone pacing back and forth outside. I couldn't ignore it any longer. I slowly got out of bed, feeling my way through the dark, and crept toward the front door. I peered through the small peephole, my heart pounding in my chest. But there was no one there. Nothing but the dark, silent night. I let out a shaky breath and stepped back, trying to process what had just happened. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but the feeling of dread remained. The whole situation felt off. I checked the locks on the door, double-checked the windows. Everything seemed secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I couldn't go back to bed. My mind was racing, and sleep seemed impossible. The night dragged on, every creak of the cabin and rustle of the trees outside making my heart race. I kept glancing out the window, hoping for some sign that the strange events were just a product of my overactive imagination. As dawn broke, the tension slowly eased, and the first rays of light illuminated the cabin. It was as if the night had never happened. The forest was quiet again, and everything seemed peaceful. But I still couldn't shake the unease that had settled deep in my bones. The whole night felt wrong, like something had been just out of sight, just out of reach, watching me from the shadows. The rest of the morning was quiet. I packed up my things, ready to leave. I had come for peace and solitude, but I couldn't escape the feeling that something had been amiss here, something I couldn't explain. As I drove away, I glanced back at the cabin, standing still in the woods, a lone figure in the vast expanse of trees. It looked harmless, peaceful even, but I knew that something had happened, something I couldn't put into words. I didn't stay at another cabin after that, and every time I thought about returning to the woods, I remembered the eerie silence, the strange feeling of being watched. The cabin had been everything I wanted, a place to escape, to relax, but it had left me with an unsettled feeling that lingered long after I left. I never went back. The cabin wasn't much, just a small, rustic place tucked away in the middle of the woods. I had rented it for a few days to get away from everything: work, people, the noise of city life. The plan was simple: disconnect, spend some time in nature, and maybe get a little reflection in. No distractions, no responsibilities, just me and the quiet. It was late afternoon when I arrived, and the light filtering through the trees was soft, golden. The cabin sat at the edge of a small clearing, surrounded by thick woods. You could hear the wind whispering through the treetops, and the air had that earthy, clean smell that only forests have. I parked my old truck by the side, grabbed my backpack, and made my way up the stone path to the front door. The place had been described as rustic, and that was accurate. The door creaked when I opened it, and the floorboards groaned under my boots as I stepped inside. The living room had a simple setup: an old sofa, a stone fireplace, and a few mismatched chairs. There was a small kitchen in the corner with a wood stove and a set of stairs leading to a loft where the bed was. I wasn't expecting luxury, and I didn't need it. This was exactly what I had come for. I dumped my gear on the floor, set up the wood stove to warm the cabin, and started unpacking. The fire crackled, and I sat in the chair by the hearth, staring out the window at the woods, sipping from the thermos of coffee I had brought with me. The first night was calm. I cooked a simple meal, pasta, nothing fancy, and ate alone in the quiet, listening to the occasional hoot of an owl in the distance. Afterward, I read for a bit by the fire before turning in. The bed was surprisingly comfortable for its age, and the sounds of the forest outside lulled me to sleep. But that's when things started to get weird. The next morning, I woke up early. The sun hadn't even fully risen yet, and a mist was rolling in from the forest. I made coffee, brewed it strong, and sat outside on the small porch. The air was cool and the world was still. The only sounds were the birds in the trees and the occasional rustle of leaves as the wind blew through. It was peaceful, too peaceful, in fact. It wasn't normal for a forest to feel this quiet. There were no sounds of insects or critters in the underbrush. I brushed it off. Maybe it was just early, and the wildlife was still asleep. I went for a walk to stretch my legs and explore the area a bit. The woods were dense, the trees towering above me like silent sentinels. The path I walked on was narrow and winding, the kind you could only find in places that hadn't been touched by civilization in a while. After a couple of hours, I found a small creek that ran through the woods. It was beautiful, the water clear and the rocks slippery from the constant flow. I crouched down to wash my hands in the cool water when I noticed something odd. There was something sticking out of the mud by the bank. I reached for it, and when I pulled it free, I saw that it was a small, weathered box. It was old, the wood dark and cracked from years of exposure to the elements. At first, I thought it might be some sort of treasure chest, something left behind by people long ago. But as I opened it, the weight of the moment hit me. Inside the box was a small bundle of cloth, wrapped tightly. I unwrapped it carefully, revealing what looked like a set of old tools: a knife, a small hammer, and a few other things I didn't recognize. I stared at the items for a moment, trying to make sense of it all. There was nothing about the box or the tools that seemed dangerous, but it still felt wrong somehow. I closed the box and put it back in the creek, letting the current take it away. The rest of the day passed without incident, though I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. That evening, as I sat by the fire, the woods outside felt too quiet again. It was as if everything had gone still, holding its breath. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was just being paranoid. That night, I slept fitfully, waking several times to the sound of something scraping against the cabin walls. It wasn't the wind. The scraping was deliberate, slow, like someone or something was dragging something heavy along the outside of the cabin. I grabbed the flashlight and checked outside, but there was nothing. No animals. No signs of anything that could explain the noise. The next morning, I decided to leave. There was an unease in the air, something I couldn't explain. The thought of spending another night in that cabin, hearing that scraping noise again, made my skin crawl. But as I packed my things, I realized something strange. The front door, which had been locked the night before, was wide open. I didn't remember opening it. I could have sworn I locked it when I came in. I stood there for a moment, frozen in place, trying to process what I was seeing. Felt like my heart was pounding in my chest, but I didn't know why. Maybe I had left it open and forgotten. Maybe I had been too tired to notice. But as I stepped through the door and into the clearing, something caught my eye. A shape just on the edge of the woods, standing still, watching. I froze, staring at it, and whatever it was stepped back into the trees, disappearing from sight. I don't know how long I stood there, trying to convince myself it was nothing. Maybe it was a deer, or someone out for a walk, but deep down I knew it wasn't. I grabbed my things and drove away, not stopping until I reached the nearest town. It wasn't until then that I could finally breathe again, like the weight on my chest had lifted. The town was quiet and normal, people going about their business. The cabin, the woods, and whatever I had seen were far behind me now. But as I checked into a motel, I felt a twinge of something, a thought that wouldn't leave me. That box I found by the creek, I hadn't thrown it far enough. It wasn't a treasure chest at all, and the tools inside weren't from some old, forgotten past. No, they were tools for something much more recent, much more sinister. I don't know what the person in the woods wanted. I don't know what that box meant or why I felt watched the entire time I was there. But I'm not going back to that cabin. Not now, not ever. Some things are better left alone, buried, or forgotten in the woods. I was 33 when I decided to take a break from everything. It was late September 2017, and things were starting to weigh me down in ways I hadn't really admitted to anyone. I worked long hours in a warehouse on the south side of Des Moines, and the night shifts had worn me thin. I wasn't sleeping well. I was getting these headaches that started around my temples and wouldn't let up until I was half blind from the pain. I wasn't seeing anyone. My phone barely rang, and I'd spend whole weekends sitting in a dark apartment pretending I was resting. I knew I needed to change something before I broke down completely. A guy I used to work with, Mark, told me about a cabin he stayed in once near the edge of Chippewa National Forest in northern Minnesota. He said it was quiet, remote, no neighbors, nothing around but trees and water. That sounded like exactly what I needed. I found it listed online. A small wooden place with a screened porch, wood-burning stove, and a small dock stretching out into a still lake. It was about a 4-hour drive north of Grand Rapids. I booked it for 12 days. I left early on a Monday, packed up my old Ford Focus with canned food, dry snacks, a few gallons of water, a folding knife, a flare gun, and a small generator. I brought a fishing rod, even though I didn't really know how to fish, and a stack of books I kept meaning to read. The weather was just starting to shift into fall, and the air smelled cleaner the farther north I drove. There weren't many cars once I passed Deer River, and the roads turned to gravel not long after that. I didn't see another person for the last 20 minutes of the drive. The last turn was marked by a rusty sign half swallowed by weeds. The tires crunched over broken twigs and uneven ground as I pulled in. The cabin looked exactly like the photos, maybe smaller in person, but solid. Weather-worn boards, a steep roof, 2 front steps leading to a sagging door. There was an old shed nearby, half covered in ivy. The lake stretched out behind the place, surrounded by trees that reflected off the water like glass. I didn't see or hear anything out of place. It felt like I'd driven off the edge of the world. Inside, it smelled like dry wood and a little like mice, but it was clean enough. A cot by the wall, an old armchair, a stone fireplace, and a tiny kitchen area with a sink that didn't work. The generator had enough fuel for a couple of hours each night if I used it right. I unpacked slowly, took my time organizing the shelves, checked the windows to make sure they latched. I found a dead spider curled behind the nightstand and tossed it out the front door. The first few days were uneventful. I woke up with the sun, made simple breakfasts, and sat on the dock watching the fog roll off the water. I walked the narrow trails around the property, collected fallen branches to use in the fireplace, and took naps when I felt tired. I wrote in a small notebook, mostly just fragments of thoughts and sketches of trees. No one knew exactly where I was. I told my sister I was going to be up north for a while, but I didn't give her the exact address. I didn't want to be reached. I was on my 5th night when things started to feel off. I woke up around 3 in the morning. I don't remember what pulled me out of sleep. Maybe a sound, maybe a dream, but I was suddenly wide awake, and the room was freezing. The fire had died down to embers, and I could see my breath. I got up to throw a few logs in, and as I did, I glanced out the front window. The moon was low and bright, and I could clearly see the trail that led from the road to the cabin. And right there, just at the edge where the trees started, I saw something strange. It wasn't a person, I didn't think it was, but there was a dark shape just standing there. It didn't move. I stood frozen with one hand on the wood stove handle, staring at it. It wasn't tall, maybe the height of a big dog, but too wide, too upright. I waited, thinking maybe it was a stump or a trick of the light. I stood there for over a minute, and then I blinked, and it was gone. I barely slept the rest of the night. The next morning, I went outside to check. The ground was soft with dew and leaves, but I didn't see any tracks. I walked the trail back toward the road slowly, looking for anything out of place. Nothing. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me. I tried to shake it off, but over the next few nights, more things started happening. One morning, I woke up and found the porch screen hanging loose from one side. The nails looked like they'd been pulled, not rusted out. I fixed it with a rock and a thick stick since I didn't have tools. The night after that, I heard something knock against the back wall of the cabin. Not an animal scratch, a solid thud. Just once, but loud enough to wake me. I started sleeping with the knife in my hand. I kept the generator off to avoid the noise. I spent more time inside. I stopped walking the trails. On the 9th night, I heard what I thought was someone moving outside around 2 in the morning. It was slow, careful steps on the dried leaves. I turned off my flashlight and crouched by the window. There was nothing visible, but I could hear the sound of something walking. It circled the cabin once. I heard the soft crunch of it stepping near the shed, then near the dock, then just under the front window. Then it stopped. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. The steps didn't come back. I stayed like that for an hour. At sunrise, I went outside. There were no prints, no signs of disturbance, nothing to prove what I'd heard. But I knew I'd heard it. I didn't imagine that. It wasn't a deer. It walked in a circle around the place and stopped directly under the front window. That day, I started packing. I had 3 nights left on my stay, but something in me snapped. I didn't care about the money anymore. I loaded up everything I could and kept the rest near the door. I kept the knife in my coat pocket and didn't let my back face the windows. I planned to leave first thing in the morning. I didn't want to drive in the dark. I thought maybe whoever or whatever it was might be less bold in daylight. That last night, I barely slept. I kept my coat and boots on. I kept the flashlight in my lap and the generator off. Around midnight, I heard movement again. This time, it was slower. I knew the rhythm now. It wasn't an animal's curiosity. It was deliberate. Whoever it was, they weren't trying to get in. They were just making their presence known. At around 2 in the morning, I heard something new. A scraping sound from behind the cabin. Not metal, not wood, more like something heavy being dragged across rock. It went on for nearly 5 minutes, then silence. I waited until first light. I threw the rest of my things into the trunk and didn't even check the back of the cabin. I just left. I drove fast down the gravel road and didn't stop until I hit pavement again. Once I got home, I didn't talk about what happened, not even to Mark. I didn't report anything. What would I say? That someone wandered the woods around my cabin and didn't actually do anything? That I saw a shape standing on a trail one night and heard footsteps outside? Took a long time to feel comfortable sleeping again. I moved apartments. I got a dog. I didn't take another solo trip after that. About 8 months later, I saw something on the local news. A brief story about a missing hiker found dead near Chippewa National Forest. They didn't give details, just said the man had gone off-grid and was discovered after months of searching. The photo they showed of the area was taken from a helicopter. I recognized the trees. I recognized the lake. It was maybe half a mile from that cabin. They never said how he died, just that he had succumbed to the elements. I knew better. The woods up there weren't empty. Someone was living out there. Someone who didn't want to be found, and who didn't want anyone else there either. I never went back. I've never even driven north since, and I'm glad I left when I did. I don't know what would have happened if I'd stayed just one more night. It was the fall of 2018 when I decided to spend a week alone in a remote cabin in Idaho. I was 34 at the time, working a stressful job in Seattle, and I just needed to get away from people, phones, and deadlines. I'd never taken a solo trip like that before, but I found a listing for a small off-grid cabin in the Sawtooth Mountains. It was a bit pricey, but it looked exactly like what I needed. Secluded, quiet, and surrounded by trees. The photos showed a plain wooden structure with a front porch, a wood stove, and a view of the hills through the pines. No neighbors for miles, no Wi-Fi, barely any cell reception. I left on a Monday morning in my truck. It was early October, and the air was already starting to cool down. The drive took about 10 hours, most of it through open land, winding roads, and forest. When I finally turned off the main road and onto a dirt path that twisted uphill for miles, I started to feel the isolation set in. I had to go slow. There were dips and loose rocks, and I didn't want to blow a tire out there. Eventually, I reached the clearing where the cabin sat. It was even more isolated than I expected. No buildings, no fences, nothing but pine trees in every direction. I parked the truck, shut it off, and for a few minutes I just stood there, listening. It was dead silent. I didn't even hear birds. The cabin was small but solid. It had been built by hand in the 70s, from what I read online, and it had that old wood smell when I opened the door. Inside, it was simple, one room with a twin bed against the back wall, a tiny kitchen set up with a propane stove, a wood-burning heater in the corner, a folding table, and a single old armchair. There was a solar panel outside for a little bit of electricity, enough for a light bulb and charging a phone if needed. No running water, but a large water container sat by the sink with a foot pump. There was also an outhouse a short walk into the woods. The first day was peaceful. I unpacked my cooler and gear, took a short walk around the area to get a sense of where things were, then spent the evening reading and cooking rice and beans. It got dark fast out there. By 7:30, it was pitch black, and the only sounds were the crackling fire in the stove and the occasional rustling outside. I went to bed around 9, wrapped in blankets since the temperature had dropped into the 30s. The next morning, I woke up early, sometime around 6, when the sun was just starting to light up the trees. I had breakfast and decided to hike up the ridge behind the cabin. I had a map with a few hand-drawn trails the owner had left in a binder. The trail was steep but manageable, and after about an hour of walking, I reached a clearing that looked down into the valley. The view was worth it. Miles of forest, empty land, and distant snow-capped peaks. I stayed up there for a while, just enjoying the silence. On the way back down, I noticed a few things I hadn't seen on the way up. About 300 feet off the trail, I saw an old pile of chopped logs, half buried under brush. They were gray and cracked, clearly not recent. Not far from that, maybe another 100 feet through the trees, I saw a rusted metal drum and what looked like a broken wooden crate. It didn't seem like much, just old junk left behind, but I marked the spot mentally in case I wanted to explore it later. Back at the cabin, I spent the afternoon reading and writing in a notebook. Around 4, I started making dinner. It got dark again quickly, and I noticed how still everything was. Not just quiet, still. No wind, no sounds. I sat out on the porch with my coat on, watching the last bit of light disappear behind the trees. That's when I saw something strange. About 50 yards away, just past the clearing where the trees began, I saw movement. It wasn't clear, just a flash, like someone stepping behind a tree. I stared at the spot, waiting to see if anything else would move. Nothing did. I stood up and looked harder, but all I saw were trees. I figured it was probably a deer or something, but it left me feeling a little uneasy. That night, I had trouble sleeping. I kept thinking about the shape I thought I saw. I left the lantern on low and stayed awake, listening. Sometime after midnight, I heard a sound that pulled me upright in bed. It was faint, but I knew I wasn't imagining it. Footsteps. Slow, crunching steps in the leaves outside. Not the skittering of a raccoon or the thump of a deer. These were slow, deliberate steps. I held my breath and stayed completely still. The footsteps stopped near the side of the cabin. I stared at the wall, heart pounding, wondering if whoever or whatever it was could see the light coming from the lantern. After a minute or two, I heard the steps again, this time moving away. They faded until I couldn't hear them anymore. I didn't sleep at all after that. In the morning, I went outside and looked around. There were faint marks in the dirt by the side of the cabin. It had rained slightly the night before, so the ground was soft. I saw 2 clear boot prints, not animal tracks, boots. Someone had been there. I spent most of the day on edge. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but I didn't want to overreact. Maybe it was a hunter or someone passing through, but the area was supposed to be uninhabited, and there were no trails nearby. I didn't see or hear anyone all day. I didn't go back up the ridge. That night, I made sure all the windows were covered, and I turned off the lantern before I got into bed. Around 2 a.m., I heard something again. This time, it was more than footsteps. I heard what sounded like something tapping against the wall, 3 sharp knocks. I stayed in bed, frozen, clutching the knife I kept next to me. The knocks came again, but softer. Then nothing. In the morning, I walked around the cabin again. I found more boot prints, fresher this time. They led from the trees to the back of the cabin and then back out. No sign of who made them. That afternoon, I hiked toward the area where I'd seen the old junk pile. I wanted to see if there was anything else there, any sign of people. When I got closer, I noticed more than I had before. There was a tarp partly buried in dirt and pine needles, and underneath it was a large metal box. It looked like a storage trunk, the kind with a latch. It was locked, but the top was dented and scratched, like it had been forced open in the past. Nearby, I found what looked like a fire pit, long abandoned. Burned cans, broken glass, and bones. Animal bones, I told myself. Probably people had camped there years ago and left trash behind. Still, the whole area felt off. I headed back before it got dark. That night, the sounds came back. This time, it wasn't just footsteps or knocking. I heard the soft crunch of leaves, then what sounded like someone dragging something across the porch. Something heavy. I sat up, barely breathing. The dragging stopped. I waited for what felt like hours. I heard nothing else. The next morning, I found marks on the porch. Long, dark streaks across the wooden boards, like something had been scraped across it. There was also something else. Wedged under the edge of the porch was a small piece of torn fabric, dark gray, like from a jacket. It wasn't mine. I didn't touch it. That was it. I decided I wasn't staying another night. I packed everything up and loaded the truck as fast as I could. Before I left, I took one last look around. I didn't see anyone. The woods were still, but the whole place felt wrong, like something had happened there and I'd gotten too close to it. On the drive back down the mountain, I kept checking the rearview mirror. I felt like I was being watched the whole time. When I got to the main road, I stopped and sent a message to the cabin owner. I didn't go into details, just said there had been signs of someone around the property and that he might want to check it out. I never got a reply. A week later, back home in Seattle, I looked up the area online again. I found an old article from 2004. It mentioned a man who had gone missing while hiking in that same part of the Sawtooths. He'd been camping alone, last seen by a ranger who passed him on a trail. His camp was found abandoned, and no trace of him was ever recovered. The article said something about an old logging camp nearby, long since shut down, and how a few locals thought people still squatted in those woods from time to time. I never found out who was outside my cabin those nights. I don't know what they wanted or how long they'd been out there. I don't know if they were living in those woods or if they just passed through. All I know is that someone was out there watching me, and they didn't want me to know they were there. Not at first. I haven't gone back to the woods since. I still think about it, though, especially when I hear things at night. Sounds outside my window, steps on the sidewalk when it should be quiet. I tell myself it's nothing. I tell myself I'm safe now. But sometimes, when I close my eyes, I still see those boot prints in the dirt, and I still wonder if someone followed me down that mountain. I was 31 when I decided to take a break from everything and head up to a remote cabin in northern Montana. It was late October 2017, and I had been grinding non-stop at my job as a freelance photo editor in Portland. Deadlines, revisions, client demands. I felt like I hadn't taken a real breath in over a year. A friend of a friend had mentioned this old hunting cabin way off the Maine roads, up near Lake Koocanusa, and after a bit of calling around, I managed to get the keys from some old guy named Jack who barely used it anymore. It wasn't a fancy rental or anything. It was an old place, built in the early 70s by Jack's father and uncles. He warned me it didn't have electricity, and the water came from a pump well out back. I didn't care. I packed up my old Subaru Forester with all the supplies I figured I'd need. Cans of food, firewood, 2 full gas cans, a solar-powered lantern, a few jugs of water just in case, and my camping gear. I even brought my .22 rifle for target shooting, not that I planned to hunt. It just felt better having it out there in the woods. The drive took nearly 11 hours with stops. The last 40 minutes were on gravel roads that grew narrower the deeper I got into the woods. The trees started closing in on the car like a tunnel, and I remember the sun dipping behind the hills just as I pulled up to the cabin. The first thing I noticed was the silence. Not peaceful quiet, but real, heavy silence. No wind, no birds, just the crunch of gravel under my tires and the tick of the engine cooling when I parked. The cabin was smaller than I expected. Just one big room with a wood stove in the center, a single bed along the far wall, a table with 2 chairs, and shelves lined with old tin cups and dusty canned goods. There was a small storage shed out back and a steel pump about 10 yards from the front steps. The windows were dirty, the air stale, and there were cobwebs in the corners, but it didn't feel abandoned, just old and rarely used. I spent the first hour cleaning out dust, airing the place out, and lighting a fire in the stove. The wood burned slow, the smell filling the room with warmth. I set up my sleeping bag on the bed since the mattress looked like it hadn't been touched in a decade. After eating a cold can of chili and listening to the trees outside creak, I sat by the fire until I couldn't keep my eyes open. The first night was uneventful, cold but quiet. I woke up a couple of times to the sounds of wind rattling the walls, but I didn't feel unsafe. The cabin felt solid. The door had a big steel bolt lock, and the windows were thick. I actually slept in the next morning, not waking up until nearly 9. I made coffee on my little camping stove, pumped some water to wash my face, and then spent the day hiking the nearby trails. I brought my camera and got some great shots of the lake and the fog lifting over the hills. That evening, I made a fire, cooked up a can of stew, and sat on the porch as the sky turned orange and then blue. I remember thinking how nice it was to be disconnected. No phone service, no email, no noise. Just me, the fire, and the woods. The third night is when things started to feel off. It was close to midnight when I woke up. Not from a sound, but from a feeling. The fire in the stove had died down, and the cabin was nearly pitch black except for the faint glow from the coals. I lay there, trying to figure out what had stirred me. Then I realized I was freezing. My breath was visible in the air, and my sleeping bag wasn't cutting it. I got up, pulled on my jacket, and went to the woodpile by the stove. As I bent down, I thought I heard something outside. Not footsteps exactly, more like a crunch. A slow, heavy crunch on the gravel. Then it stopped. I stood there, holding my breath. I moved to the window and peered out, but the night was too dark. No moon, no shadows. I told myself it was probably a deer or maybe just the wind knocking something loose. Still, I grabbed my rifle and kept it next to the bed when I lay back down. The next morning, I found tracks in the dirt around the cabin. At first I assumed they were mine, but these were fresh and didn't match my boots. They were longer, wider, heavy soles. Work boots, maybe. They circled the cabin once, paused by the back window, and then led off into the trees. That was the first time I got the knot in my stomach. I didn't see any vehicles nearby. I hadn't heard anything the night before, just silence. And these prints. I walked out about 50 yards into the woods, following them as best I could, but they faded fast in the underbrush. I turned back, kept checking behind me, and locked the cabin door as soon as I stepped inside. The rest of the day I stayed close. No more hikes. I read, chopped more firewood, and tried to tell myself it was nothing. Maybe Jack had come to check on the place or some hunter wandered too close, but it still didn't sit right. That night, I left the fire burning high and stayed up later than usual. I kept the rifle across my lap and sat at the table with my lantern on low. Every creak outside had my heart jump. I dozed off eventually, only to be woken again, this time by a thud. A clear, solid thud from the back of the cabin. My skin went cold instantly. I didn't move. I just sat there in the dark, listening. Another thud, like something hitting wood. Then silence. I waited, barely breathing. After maybe 5 minutes, I crept toward the back window and lifted the edge of the curtain. I couldn't see anything. The night swallowed everything. I didn't go outside. I didn't want to know. Morning came slow. I walked out back and found nothing at first. Then I noticed a chunk of wood from the wall splintered near the bottom corner, like something had been jabbed into it. There were more boot prints. And then, behind the shed, I found a cigarette, but fresh. Still smelled like smoke. I don't smoke. I packed that afternoon. I wasn't even halfway through my planned stay, but something was wrong. I could feel it in my gut. I filled the car, locked up the cabin, and drove, or tried to. About 2 miles down the gravel road, I found a tree down across the path. It was a fresh fall. Pine needles still green, trunk still oozing sap. It hadn't been there when I came in. Someone had cut it, clean, straight through with a chainsaw. No storm had knocked it. I stopped the car and got out to check. My stomach dropped when I saw the saw marks. I looked around, trying to hear anything. An engine, footsteps, breathing. But the woods were dead quiet. I had an axe in the back, and I started hacking at the tree, trying to clear enough to drive over or around. Took over an hour. The whole time, I kept checking the woods, expecting someone to step out. No one came, but the feeling of being watched was unbearable. When I finally cleared enough to pass, I floored it and didn't slow down until I hit pavement again. I didn't go home right away. I drove to Libby, a nearby town, and got a motel. I barely slept. The next morning, I called Jack and told him someone had been messing around near the cabin. He didn't sound surprised, just said, "Yeah, sometimes weirdos wander up there." That was it. I left it alone for a while, tried to forget it. But 2 weeks later, I got an email from an unknown address with just one line. "You shouldn't have left so early." No name, no reply option. Just that. I reported it. The police said there wasn't much they could do. No real threat. No name. They filed a report, but that was it. I changed my number. Got a new email. I moved apartments. A few months later, I met a guy who worked with Forest Services out that way. Over drinks, I told him a bit about the cabin. He got quiet when I mentioned the lake and the blocked road. Finally, he said, "That side of the forest, we don't patrol much. Too many old mining trails. Some people squat out there. Some don't want to be found." I never went back. I sold my camera gear not long after. The photos from that trip, I deleted all of them. Even now, I think about it sometimes. The tracks, the cigarette, the cut tree. But what really sticks with me is how quiet it was. Whoever it was, they didn't try to break in. They just let me know they were there, watching, close, waiting. And the worst part is, I don't think they wanted to hurt me. Not then. They wanted me to come back, to stay longer. But I didn't, and I won't. I was 36 the summer I decided to take a break from everything. My name's Darren, and I'd been working a stressful job in a tech company in Portland for the past 9 years. That year, 2019, things had reached a point where I couldn't go a week without grinding my teeth in my sleep or having a stiff neck from stress. My doctor suggested I take some time off, disconnect completely, and let my body and mind breathe. So I did. Instead of going to some expensive spa or flying to another country, I rented a small cabin up in northern Idaho. It was far from everything, no internet, no cell signal, no neighbors for at least 2 miles. It was exactly what I thought I needed. The cabin was near Priest Lake, tucked deep in the forest off a gravel road that barely had tire tracks. I found it through a small rental website that didn't get much traffic, and the owner, a man named Frank, said not many people wanted to go out that far. That was perfect for me. The drive there took nearly 8 hours. I took my old 2009 Subaru Outback, packed it with a cooler full of simple groceries, a few books, a battery-powered lantern, and my old camping gear just in case. I reached the cabin a little after 3 p.m. on a Tuesday, early July. It was warm, humid, and the mosquitoes were already starting to swarm the moment I stepped out of the car. The cabin looked even better in person than it did in the pictures. Small, weathered wood exterior, tin roof, a porch that creaked under your boots, and a screened-in door that slammed shut if you let it go. Inside, it smelled like dust and old pine. There was a small bedroom, a wood stove, and a simple kitchen with a propane-powered fridge and stove. No microwave, no TV. Just a few shelves of books, some pans, and a drawer full of mismatched utensils. The first few days were peaceful. I'd wake up with the sun, brew some coffee on the stove, and sit outside watching the light creep through the trees. I didn't do much, mostly read, wrote in a notebook, walked around the nearby trails, and just tried to reset my brain. The only sounds were birds, the wind through the trees, and the occasional rustle of something moving through the underbrush. It felt like time had slowed down. On the 5th day, something small changed. I woke up to find my front porch mat moved a few feet from where it had been. I placed it right in front of the door, but now it was off to the side. It wasn't a big deal, and I figured it had blown in the wind or maybe an animal had dragged it. Still, I made a mental note of it. Later that evening, I noticed the firewood stack on the side of the cabin looked off. A few logs were scattered near the ground, like someone had tripped over them or tossed them aside. Again, I chalked it up to a raccoon or maybe even a bear sniffing around. I kept my flashlight and bear spray closer that night. On the 6th day, I took a longer hike through a trail that looped around a creek a few miles east of the cabin. It was beautiful, thick trees on either side, moss-covered stones, the sound of rushing water always nearby. I brought a sandwich and a bottle of water, and I stayed out most of the afternoon. When I got back around 4 p.m., something immediately felt wrong. The cabin door was cracked open. Not wide, but just enough that I could see the shadow of the inside from where I stood at the bottom of the porch steps. I'd locked it when I left. I always double-checked. My stomach dropped. I stood there for at least a minute, just listening. The woods were quiet. No birds, no squirrels, just stillness. My first thought was that someone had broken in. Maybe a hunter, maybe someone living out here. I stepped inside slowly, flashlight in one hand, bear spray in the other. Everything inside looked normal at first. The table was where I left it, chairs untouched, books still stacked near the couch. But the bedroom door was slightly ajar, and I knew I'd left it fully open. I crept toward it, pushed it gently with the tip of my boot, and peeked in. Nothing. The bed was untouched. The window was still locked. I went through every inch of the cabin, checked behind the couch, under the bed, in the tiny crawl space below the floorboards. Nothing. No signs of anyone. But still, I didn't feel right. Something had changed in that place. I kept the lights on all night, even though it meant burning through more batteries than I'd planned. The next morning, I found something small but disturbing. On the porch railing was a small, deep scratch, like someone had run a knife or a rock along the edge. It hadn't been there the day before. The wood was fresh, pale, and clean, clearly new. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, looking for more signs. I found a cigarette, but near the side of the woodshed. I don't smoke. That was the moment the trip stopped feeling like a break and started feeling like a mistake. I decided I'd stay one more night and leave the next morning. I didn't feel safe. I tried to calm myself down, telling myself it could have been an old maintenance worker or a past renter's trash. But in the back of my mind, I felt watched. Like something in those trees knew I was alone and far from help. That night, I barely slept. I kept the flashlight in my hand and the bear spray under my pillow. Around 2 a.m., I heard a noise outside. Not an animal noise. It was deliberate. Footsteps. Slow, heavy, crunching through the leaves and pine needles. I held my breath and listened. The steps circled the cabin. They paused at the porch. Then I heard the porch boards creak, slowly, one at a time. Whoever it was, they didn't knock. They didn't say anything, just stood there. I didn't move. I didn't make a sound. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my teeth. After maybe 2 minutes, the steps moved away. I waited a long time, probably an hour, before I dared to look through the window. I didn't see anyone. But the next morning, I found a boot print in the dirt just off the porch. It was big, bigger than mine. I took a photo of it with my old camera, grabbed all my things, and threw them into the car. On my way out, the gravel road seemed longer than I remembered. I checked my rearview mirror every few minutes. My hands were shaking the whole time. I stopped only once, at a small gas station an hour away. I bought coffee, used the bathroom, and asked if anyone else ever stayed out by the lake where that cabin was. The guy behind the counter just shook his head and said not many people went that deep into the forest anymore. I made it home that evening and didn't tell anyone the full story. I didn't think they'd believe it. I tried to report it, just in case. Sent an email to the owner of the cabin with the boot print photo and a brief description. I never got a reply. 2 weeks later, I had a security system installed in my apartment. I haven't gone camping since. I don't think I ever will. There was no big confrontation, no dramatic ending, just this steady, rising fear that someone knew I was there, alone and unarmed, and decided to scare me. Or worse, I think back sometimes to that night, the footsteps, the creaking boards, the cigarette, and I feel lucky, because whoever it was, they didn't break in. They didn't try the door. Maybe they were testing me. Maybe they wanted to see how far they could push without making a move. But I left. I trusted my instincts, and I got out before it went any further. And that, I think, is why I'm still here,